Yes, so the title for my talk is Partisia Blockchain, a source for good controlled by the individual. I will be going through some of the vision and the use cases for Partisia Blockchain and how that differs from what you can do with a public blockchain in general. So my first slide here is a quote from Joseph Campbell, who was a scholar of myth. And so it says that computers are like Old Testament gods, lots of rules and no mercy. This is even more true for a blockchain, because the way it works is that when the necessary conditions for change on the database have been met, there are irreversible changes added to a permanent ledger. Or you would say that there are things more or less set in stone that you cannot reverse. The way a traditional database works is that you have a computer, and if that computer gets hacked, then you basically compromise the entire database. But the basic thing of a blockchain is that it works through a consensus mechanism, and when the necessary conditions for the consensus is met, a permanent change happens on the global blockchain. So the problem that I am going to address is how can you make the world a better place with Partisia Blockchain as your platform. I will first go through something, a little bit of Partisia Blockchain's vision for the future, how you're building trust, how that corresponds to sustainable development goals. I will talk about some of our successful use cases, the role of the smart contract in all this, and the types of challenges that zero-knowledge smart contracts can help you solve. So trust is the necessary condition for all human transactions. What I'm trying to illustrate with this picture is basically, as you might see from it, it's an unmanned fruit stand. It's a very, very common sight in Denmark. The reason why it's unmanned is because there is a cultural enforcement mechanism that ensures the trust of the person who puts out his goods here. The cultural enforcement mechanism basically means that it's commonly understood that it would be morally reprehensible to steal from the fruit stand, to take the product or to take the money there. So today people will mostly use mobile payment apps, but traditionally it used to be a jam jar where people would just put the cash directly and everybody could basically come and steal from the fruit stand. But that almost never happens. And the reason why the trust is so important for this transaction to happen is that if this fruit stand was manned, the transaction would never happen because it would be too expensive for the person who produced this product. If he had to also put time in to sell the product himself, then it would be unmanageable to basically make this service and this product available to the consumer. So this is just a little bit extra money that the farmer can make for himself. But it's all depending on how the trust is being established. So in a very cohesive, safe society, a cultural enforcement mechanism means that people can have very good market access, and neither the consumer or the seller needs to fear of any foul play in this type of transaction. However, when we move into, let's say, a less maybe stable society or look back in the past, we'll see that you need different enforcement mechanisms. Globally, we exist in a multicultural society, but more and more in the developed world, we also see that we have to integrate different kinds of cultures, different kinds of values into society. So when you have that kind of situation, you need something else than cultural enforcement. You need a framework of law enforcement. You need some kind of temporal enforcement. But even temporal enforcement and the power of the state do has some kind of, let's say, tendencies to overreach. So you can have a situation where you have too little temporal enforcement. There's not a strong enough civil society. There's not a strong enough, let's say, the power structure of society is maybe too uncohesive. You have a weak state, for example, don't have a good police force, you have corruption. In those kind of situations, the trust in the market breaks down. So you can either have, let's say, an extreme case would be anarchy, or you can have a totalitarian state. So both those situations creates distrust, and basically means that a failure to make the enforcement mechanisms that establish the trust that generates the productivity and generates the transactions. What we then think we can move towards is cryptographic enforcement. And I go a little bit more into detail how this actually works, but the idea is that through using the technology of private keys that are known only to the individual, then you can actually create safe transactions between individuals without needing the meddling of the state or some kind of other strong institutional body. So now I'll get into how this corresponds to the UN Sustainable Development Goals. Partisia Blockchain as a company is committed to these goals, and on face value it might seem like this is just insurmountable problems in many ways. First of all, there are 17 goals, which is already quite a lot. It seems like we're shooting in all directions, but what you can see is that actually these goals actually stack extremely well. So if you can think of a way to make an improvement in one of these goals, then you will also have a huge impact on the other ones. Solve, for example, make accessibility of quality education, for example, then it has a huge impact on whether or not people can generate wealth or have productive agriculture, have a good healthcare system. So education relates to a lot of things. If you have a clean environment, or if you have strong legal institutions, then you also have the possibility of having wealth. For example, if you can protect private property, then you create prosperity. So no matter what goal you look at, you'll see that it's related to other goals. So it's not such a completely unrealistic thing that you might use this let's say cryptographic enforcement, if you can use that for improving just within one of these domains, then can have a huge global impact. Now I'll go through some of the successful use cases we have. I'll not go into them in a lot of detail, but you can find more information about this on our webpage if you find some cases more interesting than others. But I'll just use this to illustrate how incredibly broad the scope is of solving problems with smart contracts on Partisia Blockchain. So one of the areas where we can make a huge impact is with internet privacy and user control of data. So one of the flagship projects we have is called Better Internet Search, and it's basically the ability to have targeted advertising but still keeping the individual user data secret. So you can basically choose, or let's say it's a sort of Web3 technology, we call it, where the user have control over their own data. Then we have data exchange on instars.com, and this self-sovereign identity, which is a COVID passport. And the idea is that we made an application where you can take a photograph of a person when they get the COVID-19 vaccine, and then the authority figure, for example the policeman, they just need to take a photograph of the person, and they don't gain, the authority figure doesn't gain any extra data because they can already see the individual. So when they are using the application to check whether or not they are legitimately vaccinated, for example, then they don't gain control over any extra data that they don't already have. And then in a safe way, without knowing any more about the person's identity or limiting their freedom, they can actually control whether or not they live up to the vaccine requirement. Then we also have products within financial privacy in form of financial order matching, which is a huge market to get into, because finding the commodities that you want to buy in the right price, it's of course a huge thing. But the problem is, of course, if other let's say other interested parties can see your bid, or basically what you're selling or at what price you want it, then they can take advantage of that. So if your first let's say your bid is not matched, then people can know, okay, you already have that much money, or is willing to stake that much on getting this order. Then people can take advantage of that. So by making the order matching private, you can basically provide a huge benefit in the financial system. Then another huge modern problem is cybersecurity breaches, industrial spying, and so on. People hacking private databases and holding them hostage for ransom. And what can be done there is that companies can, by the use of secret shared information, they will actually be able to report and share knowledge about security breaches. So they all have a common interest in knowing about possible threats to their security before they get attacked themselves, but they need to protect their private company data, which is what's under attack. But by using this secret sharing technology, it's possible to actually disclose knowledge about the type of threat and the nature of the threat without giving out your private company information. So that's a flagship project with the Cyber Peace Institute. Then within the healthcare sector, we have, and humanitarian projects, we have many successful pilot projects. So one of the things you can make on the blockchain is that you can make NFT based fundraising. So we have the project with Red Global Fund was basically fundraising to fight COVID. And the smart thing about this was, by selling NFT based art, it was possible to both give the artist an incentive by giving them a fraction of the donation, but at the same time the buyer of the art could redonate the art, and then it could be resold. So the more popular it was, more incentive was there for the artist to make it, so they had a strong incentive to make good art because it could actually make money, but also you could sell the same item again and again, and that way raise quite a lot of funds. Then another thing that is possible is to basically fight counterfeit medicine by proving the authenticity of products. So that's another thing you're able to do. And counterfeit medicine is, I believe, around 70% of all medicine sold in sub-Saharan Africa. So it's a huge problem. It's something that kills hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people every year. And we made this pilot project with Origin All, so that's also something to look into. Then we have auditable anonymous humanitarian token system with the International Red Cross, and this is a way of transferring funds directly to the people in crisis situations. So it's found out that one of the most efficient ways of helping out in humanitarian crisis is actually not to mandate or control what kind of aid is given to the people in need, but to give them cash or give them funds so they themselves can get the things that they think are the most important. And it's also a vital way to rebuild civil society and the fundamentals of the economy, so that the things that they actually think they need, there will actually be a demand for that because they will have funds to buy that. Then we have something called the virtual public records, which is a cooperation with Danish statistics and the health authorities to create confidential health statistics. So there are a lot of times when research is being done, then because of GDPR, the data or the personal sensitive health data, for example, it will only be available to the researcher in question who is actually doing a specific project, which was the reason for releasing this data in the first place. But what you might want to do is that you might have research that you want to compare. So you might want to compare, for example, if I have the data of some, let's say, just cancer cases in Denmark, and I have another data set where I know a lot about people's diet habits. So I might want to be able to compare those databases to see if there's a correlation between what kinds of cancer you get and what food you eat. But it might not be possible because the diet data might be from one research project and the cancer data might be in an unrelated project. So different scientists are the only ones who have access to this. But what you can basically do is that we can use this zero knowledge calculation to compare the data and guarantee the authenticity of this comparison without revealing any of the private data. So what is the role of the smart contract? So trust in transactions are built on top of institutions that deliver enforcements, and those institutions have inherent weaknesses. And that was basically my first point about the different types of enforcement. So the smart contract does not replace or fix institutions, but give us a way to patch up the cracks. And I think it's important to remember that, of course, you still need to have a civil society and government and so on. So it's not basically does not allow us to live in a complete anarchy, but it does give us a way to both take into account the possibility of market failures and state overreach. What types of challenges can zero knowledge smart contracts alleviate? And I'll not go into all of them, but let's say I'll go into a little bit more detail with the first, but then the rest you can basically extrapolate how you could do it. So one thing is democratic election integrity, an impartial trustee for transactions, internet privacy, as we already mentioned earlier, corruption. This would be in the form of basically using zero knowledge to keep the size of and identity of the bidders secret until let's say until the auction is actually finished. So for corruption, it's also one of the big possible sources for corruption or government distrust are cases where the government, for example, let a private entrepreneur bid on some huge government contract. It might be defense spending, healthcare spending, something like that. Who should deliver our new fighter planes or our new tanks? There might be billions basically at stake for the taxpayers. And how do they know that it was the best airplane or the best tank or anyway the most cost-effective product that was chosen here? Well, one way of doing it is to make sure that there can't be given any special treatment to any possible contractors. So by using a zero knowledge smart contract to make a secret bid auction is one way of basically keeping the conditions for getting this contract completely transparent. And that way you can help restore the trust in these kinds of government transactions, which would be a very good thing. Then product safety and integrity, and brand integrity is basically similar to the pilot project about the authenticity of medicine in Africa. But it goes all the way around also to, you might just want to make sure that the shirt you buy is the actual brand you think it is. Then things like payment infrastructure is super important, of course, but a way that you can actually make traceable, secure transactions that you can just use, let's say, digital currencies and transfer them between individuals without the need for a bank or a lawyer or all the extra institutional middlemen that you normally need when you do an international transfer, for example. Then the proof of ownership is also property ownership is a huge deal, because one of the biggest threats against prosperity is that you don't have institutions that can ensure property rights. So if you can just to even a small degree improve property rights in a society, then you have also vastly improved the possibility of generating wealth in that society. And then equal market access. By that I mean that smart contracts do not discriminate. The conditions are transparent, and so everybody has equal opportunity to use them. So there can't be any inherent bias, except of course what you put into the contract. But since everybody have access to creating the contracts, it's essentially equal treatment for everyone. So I'm just going to take one of the first examples how we can use smart contracts to restore trust in voting. On the side here I've made a little, I think we call it a word cloud, where you can see these are words in American news headlines over the last couple of years. And as you can see, there are a lot of negative words here. There's a lot of mistrust in the integrity of elections at the moment. And it's not just an American problem. I could have probably taken this also from Brazil or many other places in the world. There is a lot of distrust in the validity of democracy at the moment. So how can we use smart contracts to basically alleviate this problem? Traditional forms of voting have to balance voter privacy with the credibility of the result. So because if you use a paper ballot, you put it in a box, but then whether or not you trust the result depends on whether or not you trust the people who count the votes. And since if you're not watching the counting, and by the nature of the scope of this, it's not possible to watch the physical counting of all the votes for one individual. So it depends on whether or not you trust the people who are actually in charge of counting the votes. What zero knowledge voting contracts can guarantee is voter privacy and provable accurate vote counting. So the reason why I'm saying that traditional forms of voting have to balance voter privacy with the credibility of the result is that it is of course possible to make a completely public election where you put the names and identities of every voter, associate that to their vote, because then you could actually prove with 100% accuracy what the result is. And that's basically like direct democracy by show of hand. Of course that has a huge downside, which is that any potential dictator can see everybody who is voting against them and then they basically know who they need to go after if they want to seize power. Back to what the CK voting can do. Basically, it gives you the same kind of accuracy of having a complete transparent show of hands, because you can actually make a provable calculation or a provable count of the voting. But it's completely, let's say, it's completely private, so you can never actually see who voted what. You can have a provable count, but still the identity of every voter will be kept secret. So, thank you. That's all I have.